To make the bead cluster illusion necklace, you'll need 7 bicone crystal beads. Ours are 4 millimeters and they're aqua. You'll need 19 strand bead stringing wire in gold, 4 crimp beads, size number 1, also in gold, 2 clamshell bead tips in gold, a lobster clasp, and 2 jump rings, also in gold. For tools, you'll need chain nose pliers, round nose pliers, and wire cutters, and you'll also need a ruler. To get started, cut a 20-inch piece of bead stringing wire using your wire cutters. Then you're going to slide a crimp bead onto the bead stringing wire. I like to put the crimp bead in my hand because I think it's easier to fish it on. This is just one of the ways that I like to work with crimp beads. And I just use the end of the bead stringing wire to tip it onto the bead stringing wire. And I want the crimp bead to be at the center of my bead stringing wire. So I'm going to grab my 2 ends like that, and I'm just going to slide the 2 ends up, and now that crimp bead is essentially at the center. I'm using my chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to flatten that crimp bead right onto my bead stringing wire like that. So it doesn't move now. It's going to be our little stopper that's going to hold our beads in place. Now we're ready to bead, and I'm going to use that same technique of fishing the beads out of my hand. I've got my 7 bicone crystals there, and I'm going to add 1 crimp bead into the palm of my hand. And I'm going to start by beading with my bicones first. So I'm going to feed 7 bicones onto the bead stringing wire like that, and now I can just let the beads fall down my bead stringing wire because that crimp bead that we just flattened is going to hold them in place. And for this design, we chose these 4 millimeter bicones because we're going for a very delicate look. But you really could use any beads you like. You could use some gemstones, you could use different colored bicones or rondelles. We just like the idea of this very small, delicate look, so we chose 4 millimeter. And now I'm going to just feed my crimp bead on, and now slide all of those up, and there are all my beads and my 2 crimp beads, and this one is the one that's flattened already. I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to flatten the other one, but I want to make sure that there's no space or gaps in between my beads because that's the look of this. It's a nice tight little bar in the center of my necklace. So I'm kind of using gravity for that, but you can just sort of press too to make sure there's no slack. I'm going to use my chain nose pliers again and reach in and just flatten that crimp bead onto my bead stringing wire, just giving it a nice press like that. And now I can just test that and make sure that beads don't move, and they don't, which is magical. And now we're ready to finish our ends. To get started, I'm going to feed my bead stringing wire up through the center bottom of the clamshell bead tip, like that. And just let it fall right down my bead stringing wire and just ignore where it is for right now. And we're going to do some measuring. So to make sure that this bead cluster is in the center of our necklace, I'm going to start measuring from one of my flattened crimps, and I'm going to measure 8 inches on my bead stringing wire. So there's 8 inches. And now I'm going to pick up one of my crimp beads using my chain nose pliers, just like that. Makes it really manageable to just pick it up with the chain nose pliers. And I'm going to slide that crimp bead onto my bead stringing wire. And I'm sliding my crimp bead right up to the number 8. And I'm going to flatten that crimp bead right at the number 8 mark on my ruler. Just going to give it an extra push there with my chain nose pliers. And now I can take my clamshell bead tip that I slid on already and slide it all the way back up my bead stringing wire to where that flattened crimp bead is. And I'm going to hold on to that for a second, and I'm going to trim the wire first. I almost forgot to trim my wire first, so I'm going to do that first. So I've got my wire cutters here, and I'm going to just trim right on the outside of that flattened crimp bead. And now I can slide my clamshell bead tip right up and over that crimp bead like that. It's sort of nestled in the little gap that's the little sort of cave of my clam. I'm going to use my chain nose pliers and I'm going to gently press that clamshell closed over the crimp bead. And my clamshell bead tip already has loops at the ends that are closed, but you can see they didn't quite line up when I pressed the clam closed. So I'm just going to use my chain nose pliers to straighten that out like that. And now we're going to do the same thing at the other end. I'm going to flip my necklace over, take my beaded section and slide it down to the end of the ruler so that my flattened crimp is at the 0. I'm going to measure all the way out to my 8-inch mark. And then I'm going to take my clamshell bead tip, and this time I'm going to just feed it on out here at the end. I'm feeding my bead string wire up through the hole that's at the bottom of my clamshell. It's a little counterintuitive. When you first look at it, you think it would go on the other way, but it goes so that the end of the bead string wire is coming up through the bottom. So now I can take my chain nose pliers and pick up my last crimp bead and slide it on the end and measure right to that number 8 mark. And I'm going to use the pliers to just flatten that crimp right at my number 8 mark, like that. And that's going to ensure that our beaded section is at the center of our necklace. So now I can slide my clamshell bead tip up near my flattened crimp. First I'm going to trim my bead string wire next to my crimp using my wire cutters like that. And then I can slide my clamshell bead tip up over that flattened crimp and use my chain nose pliers again just to gently press the clamshell bead tip closed into place like that. And so here's our beaded section and our 2 ends, and now we're ready to finish the ends. And to do that, I'm going to open and close a jump ring using my chain nose pliers and my round nose pliers. I like to hold my jump ring just to the right of the split that's in the top of it with 1 pair of pliers, and then grasp onto the other side of that jump ring with another pair of pliers like that, and then rotate 1 down and 1 up. And what that does is it opens the jump ring without changing the shape. Now I'm just going to feed my loops that are on my clamshell bead tip onto that open jump ring like that. And then I'm going to close this side using the same technique. I'm going to grasp one side of my jump ring with 1 pair of pliers, get the other side with the other pair of pliers, and just rotate to close like that. And I always like to double check that it's closed by just sort of pressing across the jump ring like that. So that's going to be our jump ring end for our clasp. And for the other side, we're going to do the same thing to add our lobster clasp to this side of the necklace. So to do that, I'm going to pick up my jump ring. Whoops. I'm going to pick up my jump ring in my round nose pliers, or whichever pliers you prefer, and I'm grasping to one side of the split that's in my jump ring. I'm going to use my other pliers to grasp the other side, and then I'm going to rotate 1 pair of pliers up and 1 down. And that opens my jump ring. Then I can feed that open jump ring into the little loops that are on the end of my clamshell bead tip like that. And now I want to feed on my lobster clasp. So there's a little loop at the end of my lobster clasp that's open, just a little loop. I can feed that onto that jump ring. And this time, because the lobster clasp and my clamshell bead tip are both on this jump ring, I think it's too hard to try and grasp it with 2 pairs of pliers. So I'm going to just use my chain nose pliers, and I'm going to press across the jump ring to close it. There we go. And now I can take my lobster clasp and clasp it into my little loop that's on the other end. And that is my beautiful bead cluster illusion necklace. So pretty.